Have you been surprised at how bad it's been on our campuses, on our streets, kids in green bandanas, people celebrating Jew murder? I mean, how much worse can it get? And were you shocked by how bad it's been so far?
They have adopted the lexicon and the dress even
Yeah.
of the Islamic extremists.
Yeah.
And it would be as if in the wake of 9/11, there'd been a huge movement of people deciding to grow beards to look like Osama bin Laden. It's such a deranged thing to do, but it only makes sense when you realize this is totally imported. It's wholesale politics. It's buffet politics. You just take everything that's there. You take a bit of green, you take another bit of green, Hamas, you take a smattering of this, a bit of that belief. And before you know it, you're dressed in a keffiyeh and pretending to be a Palestinian jihadist.
Yeah.
In the middle of like Columbia University or Yale or something. It's completely deranged, but it's imported. And as I say, it bears repeating this thing that it plays on as an opportunistic infection. It plays on the things these students have already been taught. And one of them, by the way, as I mentioned in the book, I quote a student from Columbia who said this. I was fascinated by this. A student who said, I'm first generation from a low-income household, first generation of my family to go to university. I came to Columbia, and when I got here, I was taught the rich history of protest at Columbia University, he says. And I remember thinking, when it all kicks off again, I want to be at the center of it. What is it? It could have been climate crisis. That's what people were gearing up to have a year of protest for until Jews were massacred in Israel on the 7th. But then the 7th happens and these people have this is the thing. And then you have this extraordinarily deranged thing where they not only, 30 or so student organizations at Harvard on the 7th of October started composing a letter saying that they blamed the Israeli government for everything and that Israel was responsible and so on. And they were doing that on the 7th, again, as the massacre was ongoing. That was their first thought. But consider first, I don't know how long ago you were a student, Brenda, but when I was a student, I did not think that I could dictate foreign policy in far-off countries. It did not occur to me that I should write a letter publicly and announce what my position was on an issue of war. And I didn't, if I had done, I think I would be sectioned back in those days, if I thought that anyone was meant to listen. And then if I claimed that my own university was in some way directing the war, and that's one of the amazing misapprehensions you hear from the students across Western universities, is they seem to think that like the Israeli war cabinet is waiting to hear from the faculty at Harvard as to how they should operate in order to return the hostages and destroy Hamas. There's a set of just bewildering misapprehensions that ought normally to lead a caring adult to say, let me just take you aside for a moment and explain your problem. But as so often, as I've said many times in recent years in relation to different issues, the adults have left the room.
Yeah.
There are almost no adults, and the ones that are left behind do things like they cozy up to the students. You saw the other day, Columbia graduation finally goes ahead. Didn't happen last year. Why didn't it happen last year? Because 7th of October. Right, okay, so Columbia University in New York just can't have a graduation ceremony a year after the massacre of Jews because it'll be disrupted by people who like the massacre of Jews. Okay, nothing deranged there. And they had it this year, and they have all the protesters, and you have the keffiyeh wearers, and you have all the cosplay people. And of course, you have to disrupt the protest. But, the head of the university gives a speech where she says, tries to flatter them, tries to bargain with them, and says, among other things, how much the community is missing this reprehensible young man who was a graduate of the university. It was not actually a student, but had been helping to arrange much of the student protests. She gives a speech where she says, how much we're missing this. Why are you missing somebody who's not even a student, you dolts? You don't think there's something weird about somebody at the age of 30 living with his pregnant wife in student accommodation? Like, what? And what's he doing there? And what he's doing is he's organizing anti-Semitic protests and calling with his group for the destruction of Western civilization. That's what you're getting. But the head of the university at Columbia the other day says, we're so missing him. Yeah, I'm always missing people calling for my destruction. This is a big sentimental problem I have. But she, instead of in any way educating the students, she, like so many of the other adults, decides to flatter them and play to their narcissistic misapprehensions. And yeah, that's why we are where we are. No, not enough adults by far.
No, I think that that point you make about these kids, these Ivy League brats and others, essentially cosplaying as Palestinian militants, in the aftermath of an event in which Palestinian militants raped and murdered 1,200 Jewish people, is extraordinary. And the more I think about, however long passes, it never ceases to disgust and shock me, because this is you have a situation now where the educated youths of the West, many of whom claim to be progressive, they're trans friendly, they're often gender fluid, they claim to be the most open-minded people on earth, although they're very often the opposite. And yet they're adopting the dress and the slogans and the language of a group of Islamist nihilists who would throw them off the top of a building given half the chance. I mean, look at something like Queers for Palestine, for example. I mean, how suicidal do you think these alliances are that have arisen over the past 20 months?
All the wrong people meet at the point of hell, don't they? I mean, Judith Butler, famous, appalling gender theorist, one of the people who originated that madness, who, by the way, very amusing, she used to be a lesbian and now she's non-binary. It's like, well, if you had such foresight in the ways of gender, oughtn't you to have known in the 1980s that you were non-binary before anyone had a term for this? Anyway, these people like Judith Butler was asked some years ago, I think during the 2006 war, what attitude should we take on the progressive radical left towards groups like Hamas and Hezbollah? And she says, it's very important that we stick with them.
Yeah,
it's very important that we realize these are progressive movements as well. What are people like that actually doing? I think it's just, let's take it at its face. They will be on the side of anyone as long as that anyone is anti-Western. They will just be on the side of anyone. That can be Islamic Jihad, it can be Hezbollah, it can be Hamas, it can be Al-Qaeda, it could be any variety of anti-natalism. These will be the same people who'll celebrate abortion rights as like the best thing ever, not just talking about abortion as a sad, sometimes, necessity and so on, but as something that's just glorious and to boast about. They will be on the side of everything that is anti-Western, essentially. And this is just rife. I mean, I just wrote my column for The Spectator and mentioned Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, UK, who, in an interview with The Times 5 years ago, is asked what he'd like his place in history to be. And he says, I think that everything would be a lot better if people if privileged white men like me, do not try to seek a place in history. And you're just like, okay, this is just all part of the Danegeld paying of the time, is anything that's against Western man in particular is just, you'll get on board.
Yeah.
And it's wild how far and how wide and how big the tent can be. But you can only understand it if you understand that that's the central aim. It is just anti-West. It is anyone but ourselves.
Yeah.
And these groups, I mean, I hope they'll never get what they claim to dream for. But if they did, they'd have the usual shock, the same shock
Yeah.
that has happened throughout history in revolutionary movements when they embrace the fanatics, and the fanatics turn out to really mean it, you know.
Yeah. Well, the same shock that leftists in Iran got when they
Yes.
foolishly aligned with the Iranian Revolution in
Absolutely.
79.
Absolutely.
A big shock for those people.
Yeah, you literally help you help the situation that leads to the Ayatollah maintaining power. And then he imprisons the trade unionists and the leftists,
Yeah.
and they get massacred by the thousands in Iranian prisons. And
Yeah,
that's what had happened. That would be the future for these people. But as I say, I mean, you just hope they never see the day that they're willing on.